Okay, everybody, thank you very much for being here with us today. I'm Shahram Akbarzadeh, convener of Middle East Studies Forum, and this session is coordinated and jointly organized between Middle East Studies Forum and Governance, Development, and Peace research stream within Alfred Deakin Institute. What a mouthful. Apologies for that. So it is a pleasure to be inviting and welcoming Professor Ellen Lust to talk to us today. I have had the privilege of collaborating and working with Ellen remotely, online, a lot of Zoom meetings and emails, and we have a joint ARC application together, which we are very hopeful about to see the results of. Ellen is the founding director of the Governance and Local Development Institute, established at Yale University first in 2013, and then moved to Gothenburg in 2015. Ellen holds the Swedish Research Council International Recruitment Grant, which funds her position at Gothenburg University. She is a prolific author and scholar. I have cited some of your work, as I mentioned earlier, so it is really exciting to have you here today. Your current research project looks at the role of social institutions, local authorities, and measuring governance, which is pertinent for anyone working in the Middle East or Africa. And I do have to mention that Ellen's interest is cross-regional. I think we're going to hear a lot about how the different regions, Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, might be compared and explored. Ellen is a co-founder of Transitional Governance Project, and also consults for a number of organizations, including the Carter Center, Freedom House, USAID, and the World Bank. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Ellen to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you all for taking time in lunchtime to come in and think with me. Before I begin, I want to tell you sort of my goals for our discussion. And are we okay if I step away from we can hear me, right? So my goals are first to present to you a framework that I developed about thinking about how we can understand policy development. But it's a element, a Cambridge element that's available open access. So please don't feel like you need to buy it, but you can download it and read it, or you can even listen to it. There's an audiobook version of it. It's short, happy to tell you. But it's to present the framework, but it's not just as this is a done piece, let me tell you about my great findings. It's the basis of the work I'm using sort of going forward. And so I'm also very interested in, critical thoughts, extensions, thinking together through it. And also we're always looking for playmates, collaborators. There's a lot of work that's going on. I'll present some of that to you at the end of this so that you can get a sense of what we're doing. And if if it's of interest to you. So the objective then today, again, is to present this framework. It's found in the Cambridge Elements book that came out in November. And I'm going to illustrate it using some of the previous and some of the current research that we're doing. And then I want to discuss the future questions and projects that might be extended from this. Let's start by thinking about what we're looking at here. These are voters lining up in the elections in August of 2020. I was in the polling station in Cairo. And you might be thinking that, okay, they're thinking about who they're going to cast their ballot for, in addition to catching up with old friends and chatting. And that we, in an ideal world, would expect that they're about ready to cast their ballot for the person who's going to, help to sort of bring the best progress to Egypt, be the one who best represents their interests, makes the policies that they want to see. If you talk to them, you might find that they're also thinking about who knows who, right? This person is a friend, and he is the friend of this person. This person is, related to my Prof, that there's a lot of other things that are going through their minds, right? When the person is a good, religious, upstanding man, and voting for him, demonstrating I'm also a good, religious, upstanding woman. So there's a lot of things that are going through the mind that don't necessarily have anything to do with the ways that we think about politics, right? The ways we think about, sort of policy-oriented voting. There you might think, okay, well, that's because this is Egypt, right? Maybe, authoritarian regime, who's going to expect that these people who are going to be elected are really going to be representing policy anyway? So, maybe that's what happens over there, but it's not. I want to submit that that's not quite the case. So this is a picture of a church in the U.S., and this is right before the abortion election. But basically, the idea is that we often see that religious organizations or religious leaders are making calls upon people as to what is the right, project to vote for, right referendum to vote in, the right person to support. And that in doing so, you might not be necessarily sort of doing, voting or supporting that person because you think it's the best person to support, but rather because your religious leader told you that if you're a good religious member, this is the best person to support, right? And even if you say, well, at the ballot box, I do what I want to do, we know that, for example, especially in the recent U.S. elections, that as things become more polarized, we have people who admit to not being willing to put a yard sign out in front of their yard saying who they would support if they fear that the neighbors around them don't necessarily agree, right? And that's not because they don't support the candidate, it's because they don't necessarily feel like they will be seen as a good neighbor if they're seen as not supporting the candidate who's sort of the candidate of the neighborhood. And in doing so, even if it's not, registered at the ballot box, it affects the ways in which people think about where does the basis of popular support lie. Right? And I would submit that that in itself is an important political outcome. So we know this, right? Kind of nodding our heads, and we think about it, and we talk about these, but we talk about it in terms of things like corruption or clientelism or traditional authorities, tradition, accountability. I mean, there's a lot of words that we use to kind of denote that we know that these sort of phenomena take place, right? Ultimately, though, in some ways, they don't tell us very much, right? They tell us that we know these phenomena take place, and they usually connote that something's wrong, right? We don't necessarily have, positive normative connotations with something like clientelism, right? Or corruption, right? Corruption means things didn't work the way they were supposed to work. I want to argue that that's not necessarily the way to think about corruption or necessarily the best way to understand it, right? But even if you want to sort of make things work the way you want them to work, it's not necessarily the best way that we can sort of move forward towards outcomes that we prefer. But the reason that we have these sort of, these visions or these words and this way of thinking about it is because our conventional perspectives are both siloed and independent. I would, recognizing that we might take any single piece and say, well, it could be sort of understood this field, this field. I think that we can sort of divide the literature into three main streams. Right? The first and the most dominant, at least in political science, and I should note that, who I'm writing for are mostly people in political science and development specialists and policymakers, because those are the people who think like this, right? If I was talking to a room of anthropologists, they would probably, throw things at me and say, we know this, right? But a lot of us, if we're thinking political scientists, don't really know this or don't really think this way. So a lot of our work is state-centric, right? It has a kind of a state and non-state dichotomy, right? So a lot of the work thinks about sort of anything that's non-state is residual, right? That, it's the stuff that doesn't fit. And we, kind of tend to not differentiate it. So you actually see things that talk about state versus non-state, right? And that non-state, it might be, religious authorities and institutions, it might be ethnic ones, it might be, localities, all sorts of different ways in which those might come about. And there's often multiple, alternative authorities, which I'm going to come to in a moment, but they tend to be kind of lumped as the other, right? Alternatively, you'll see at times where there's an explicit and a priori privileging of one. So I work on religion and politics, work on ethnicity or identity and politics. all fits under that same rubric. And then sort of the centrality is thinking about how the state is either affected by or is affecting those other sets. And then again, there's a sense in which failure to see things working the way that we want to see them working is thinking about corruption or the weak state, etc. There's a second set of literature, which is a bit more recent in many ways, which tends to focus on social institutions and explicitly says, okay, social institutions exist. That often sees them as second best. It's interested in thinking about are they substitutes or complements to the state. Still sort of a bit of state centricity there. Thinks of them as automatically as being kind of informal institutions, doesn't often think about differentiating between the nature of the institutions themselves, what are the rules actually saying, or the strength of them. We see some, especially recent literature, that diverges from that a little bit. I mean, for example, there's literature that's looking about lineage systems, right? How does that affect women's attitudes towards taxation, for example? Rachel Brulé has written on that. But generally, it's sort of not necessarily distinguishing strength or not necessarily thinking about form, and usually not thinking about both at the same time. And then there's this other thing that's probably one of my biggest concern with this literature is that it often assumes that these institutions are always informal, right? So informal institutions and non-state institutions or social institutions are used almost interchangeably. It also thinks about them sometimes as the rules, sometimes it thinks about them as almost what we think as organizations. So that social institutions, there are people say, yes, CSOs and NGOs, right? So there's this multiplicity of meanings for social institutions in the literature itself, which often makes it very difficult to kind of compare or know what's really being talked about. And then there's a third set of literature, which is actually really two literatures, and that is probably closest to what I'm doing, but the most marginalized in political science, and these are the literatures on hybridity and here there's a sort of an explicit understanding that people are in contexts where there's a lot of different authorities that affect them, a lot of different sort of institutional rules by which they're expected to kind of oblige or expected to respond to, and that in some cases it thinks about how those might intersect with individuals, right? Why is it that a Black woman and a white woman are different, right? Other times it thinks about the hybridity of the context, but it often tries to amalgamate. So the idea is not necessarily to think about how these sets of institutions might act separately, but rather to think about them as sort of, kind of creating this context. There's a lot to be said for this literature. I think it's very interesting. It often doesn't provide a sort of guidance on which types of authorities or institutions are salient, extension, which different combinations would expect to have different outcomes. Often it's not really interested in sort of having a positivist approach. And so when you say, okay, well, it doesn't really make links between these contexts and outcomes, to some extent, many of the people who are writing this in this stream that's not what they're aiming to do. So it's not a gap in what they're doing. It's just that they have different objectives than what I have here. So then to sum, I mean, basically my concern is that we've often assumed rather than interrogated what sets of authorities or institutions are important. We've overlooked important distinctions. And we think about context now, and increasingly there's a lot of work that talks about the importance of context, which is great, but we don't have a very good understanding of the way of thinking about what about context is important. The result of that, I would argue, is why we get sort of a clear understanding that the theories and the kinds of development programs that get put into one place don't often work in another, right? So there's a lot of work, especially on the randomized controlled trials and the Medicaid and a lot of that literature and those efforts, which have really demonstrated this problem that we're missing something fundamental. And I would argue not only missing something fundamental in terms of understanding why this works here and that doesn't work there, but a framework that allows us to be able to take various outcomes and start to aggregate them into understanding broader theories. So my goal, of course, is to provide an alternative framework that I think will both posit first that individuals are making everyday choices as members of different communities, multiple communities which make claims on them, right? And in doing so, I want to basically set the state and various, kind of what we think of as non-state actors or authorities institutions, basically kind of on an equal footing. Rather than assuming that the state is primary or should be primary, to really think about what happens when we have these different institutions and authorities sort of affecting individual choices. And that's sort of the starting point. So let me start with some building blocks in terms of how we can think about this. The first is thinking about arenas of authority, right? So, it's going to be the case that an individual is located within multiple areas of authority, but all of us in the same room and engaged in making a single decision or cooperating together may have various sets of authorities that. So we need to understand, first of all, what is an arena of authority? And that is basically sort of this sort of notion that we are members of a sort of a community, right? And that community has clear boundaries. So I think of this very much as a football arena, right? It has clear boundaries. You can be inside or you can be outside of it, right? It might be by choice, that I've decided I'm going to join this congregation, or I've decided I'm going to join this group. It may be by sort of much less voluntary, right? I was born into this. I can't get out of my skin, but this is what I am. I can decide, how much I'm going to be attached to it, but so it can be voluntary or voluntary membership, and that there's shared goals. And I think the shared goals is probably the part that might be the hardest to initially sort of take in, right? Because, if you're thinking about your own congregation, you're thinking about your own set of friends, or certainly your own family, you can say, wait a second. We clearly do not have the same goals, right? Anytime you've heard us, arguing over what we should be doing here, or have you seen, sort of the extent to which we're vying for power from each other. So the idea isn't that there's always agreement. The idea is that the fundamental goal of perpetuating community, right, of being able to essentially kind of reproduce remains kind of a clear goal. So that's the arenas of authority. And to give you some very concrete examples, although actually I'm realizing in Australia that's maybe less of a stretch for people to see. I mean, sometimes they come with very kind of clear and demarcated boundaries, right? So this is a paramount chief in Ghana. I had the pleasure of visiting him, and first of all, he was a PhD in statistics from the US, and he'd gone back in the day that we were visiting him. He was actually training these people here who were all going to be enumerators going out to effectively conduct the census, right? So, in that case, we had a clearly demarcated boundaries. People come to him, they pay essentially, they bring him offerings or tithes. They ask him to help them to adjudicate disputes. They ask him to help their family when it needs help. So in many ways, it's very state-like. So we can have something that is that kind of clearly demarcated, but we can also have, authorities which have much less geographic, sort of basis, right? Think about something like the Catholic Church has members all over the world, and that's not necessarily sort of bound in some ways, but they still have a lot of set of obligations that they're supposed to respond to. So that gets us to the second part, which is the components of what we're going to call social institutions. And this again is so everybody's on the same page. And in many ways, which this really kind of overlaps with work by Eleanor Ostrom. Nothing sort of amazing that I'm putting forth here, but I like alliteration. So we think of this as roles, rules, and rewards, right? Where roles are simply the notion that people can take different positions within the community, and with those positions, think about priests and churchgoers, or we can think about the paramount chief and sort of the subjects, but basically they're associated with different rights and responsibilities. The rules are basically what they're supposed to do, what's permitted or required of individuals vis-a-vis other sets of individuals with roles and responsibilities, and people who are members and non-members of the community going back to the arenas. And then the rewards are the consequences. So the first question then, I mean, in this sense, I'm sort of describing a world that might make sense and it might be recognizable, I should say. But at the same time, here's one that has 1,000 different moving parts to it, right? So we've got, lots of multiple arenas with the state is but one. We have, all these different sets of rules. We've got all these different sets of kind of roles that people play. So how do we try to make this legible and useful? The first question I would argue that we need to ask is which arenas matter when and why do they exist? So let's at least start by being able to say, okay, at this point in time, what do we expect individuals to do? And we recognize that ultimately these things are dynamic, right? So, but I would argue that at any specific point in time, they're legible enough to individuals that we know what communities we're members of. We know what is expected of us, even if that might change 10 years down the line. So the first sort of way to think about this, or the first component, is to think about sort of the salience of to the action. So we're really thinking about how do we understand how people are going to vote, how do we understand when they're going to contribute to the community, public goods, whether they're going to cooperate with each other, whether they're going to resolve disputes. So this is work that I'm doing with, or actually done nicely with Kate Baldwin and Kristen Gallo and myself. And we put forth this notion of domain congruence. And that is that there are certain activities or actions that are both recognized as and more important to authority, different sets of authorities in arenas, right? And I will help to make this much more clear in a second. So basically, we can think of, in this case, we're thinking about state and customary authorities, and we're thinking about activities that take place at the local and supralocal levels, okay? And we argue that people sort of recognize that, customary authorities have more to say about how people get buried in sort of community, kind of level, and especially things that invoke some notion of what we might think of as tradition, right? And those sets of action than they do about something like building an interstate highway, right? But there are just different ways in which we think about who's relevant to what. And so this is a survey experiment that we did in Kenya, Malawi, and Zambia. And here we were basically saying to people, okay, this authority has asked you to take this action, how likely are you to do it? Right? We can talk about, sort of survey experiments and what that might mean, but basically we have, of our authorities, we have MPs, local councilors, and and the head persons and elders. And for our activities, we have voting for a president, schools, and a burial fund, okay? And the idea is that, we ask somebody, how likely would you be if your MP is asking you to contribute to a burial fund, if your customary authority is asking you to vote for a presidential candidate, etc. And what we find is that when we, some authorities just have more power, and we'll come back to that in a second. But when we basically say, okay, we're going to call this high congruence when MPs are asking you to vote for a president, right? Low congruence when MPs are asking you to contribute to a school, which is seen as a state activity, but it's at the local level instead of the super local level. Sort of high congruence when the local counselors ask you to contribute to school, low congruence when the local counselors ask you to contribute to a area. And we find that basically having congruence, in addition to all of when we take into account what types of activities, the strength of the leaders, etc., actually makes individuals more likely to comply. There is some evidence that they see this, and actually further in the piece, we talk about the fact that a lot of the evidence seems to be because they think that there's actually legitimacy for that person to ask them to do this activity. So domain congruence, we think, matters. The second thing, which I've alluded to, is this question about the strength of the arena, right? So in other words, we can think about, that some arenas just have more control over us, or more relevance to individuals than other arenas. To some extent, it can be about the level of solidarity, right? So that when you feel like you really belong to something, you want to contribute to it, you want to sort of follow the rules of the institutions that are being asked of you. There's a second part, which is of thinking about how encompassing it is. And I know this is an otter sort of notion. So encompassing is like the range of activities and outcomes and influences on an individual's lives that the arena touches. So let's imagine two arenas. And this is why I think that, the tendency to think about religious versus ethnic, et cetera, as the sort of the underlying ways of thinking about strength of arena is problematic. So we can imagine two religious sort of individuals within the religious congregations, right? In one case, that congregation, they're all of their friends, right? It's where they send their kid to school. It's where when they needed help last time, they went to the church and they were the congregation. That's where they got assistance, right? In another case, it's where they go on, occasionally on a Sunday, right? And they don't, their kids go to a different school. This is not where their friends are. So it actually, ultimately, the case where this is where your friend community is, this is also where you get your assistance, this is also where your child goes to school, where you get childcare, is going to have a sort of, it's more encompassing than the case where, this is a sort of one of many different arenas. And then the third sort of, way we can think about the strength of arenas is thinking about networks and information flows, right? So we'll talk about it in a while, but one way in which we think about why these things matter is because if you don't follow sort of the rules of the game, then you can be rewarded or you can be punished, right? Well, if nobody knows, then there's much less chance that you're going to be rewarded and punished than if that information is flowing and networks are strong. So using the same experiment that I described earlier, this is with Chris Kiyostin and I, and what we find here is that we think that people who are more proximate, who are closer to you, are more able to know what you're doing, right? They're also more likely to have various ways in which their approval or sort of acceptance affects you. So we then divide it into proximate mobilizers, who are local authorities and neighbors, and those who are in communities where we have dense social ties, that is, that most people know each other. And we find that in those cases, it is, people are more likely to say that they would follow the leader's call than in the cases where they're more distant and they're in less socially dense ties. And then there's a third notion, which is that, so, we've talked a lot about why the arena, the nature of the arena should matter, right? This is actually to say that even within the same arena, that different people may have different levels of influence, where the arena may have different levels of influence over individuals. And this is something that became clear to me, especially when I was doing work in Jordan. So one of the things that I very clearly remember was talking to a fellow faculty member, and he said, so the new chief came to visit me, the new tribal chief. It's, what do I care about him, right? This is the guy sitting in Amman, right? His tribal chief was way out in the countryside, and he has no real need for his tribal chief's approval, right? He's not going to rely on him for a job. He's not going to need him to resolve a dispute. He's not going to need him for land access. Essentially, he in many ways, both by having moved out of the community physically, right, but also having, being well educated, having sort of a lot of other access to income, etc., really didn't rely on his chief at all in the same way that, say, this grandfather. So there are notions of individual characteristics, and what I found with regards to elections in Jordan was that if you look at it, we can think of Jordanian authorities or sort of influences on electoral behavior as being, to some extent the state, although actually very little. There's sort of the Islamic, the mosques and religious organizations, and then tribal chiefs, tribal organizations. And what we find is that in the countryside, where individuals are actually, dependent on the chief for getting access to a government job and being able to sort of have land and resolve disputes, etc., that they're much more likely to vote. So turning out to vote just generally was about 70% in most rural areas versus about 35% in And they're much more likely to vote based on the sort of the tribal shape. Whereas in the urban areas, they're less likely to vote, and religious leaders and organizations have a higher. So that's sort of one way to think about the kind of individual. So now that's all great. It still doesn't explain to us why people, what people do, right? So now we know sort of who should matter. And the challenge of this part is that, ultimately, I would argue we really have to be able to think and understand, in this particular case, what is it I want to understand, what people do, who they're voting for, how they're contributing, etc. It's because, take COVID and the response to COVID, right? In some cases, imagine that your religious arena is very important to you, right? In some cases, there were religious congregations of leaders who would go out and tell everybody, stay home, don't come to church, right? Make sure that you are masking, make sure you're vaccinated, right? We have other religious congregations who said, the Lord will take care of it, come to church, don't mask, and you don't need to be vaccinated. So knowing that the religious arena tells me a lot doesn't tell me very much about what individuals do unless I actually know the specificity of those, right? And I recognize it's not a very popular thing to say, but in many ways, what this points to is the importance of actually knowing what's going on the ground in the cases we're talking about when we want to understand what, right? That said, I want to submit that there still was some ways in which we can point to what are the sets of institutional rules that we should be looking at, right? So what are the actually, kind of the broader categories of rules that we want to ask questions about. So, put them all at the same time. Well, I essentially sort of say there's three sets of rules that we can think about. One, I'm thinking about leadership selection rules, right? And here, the understanding the extent to which individuals are, have responsiveness from various leaders who are outside of the state or apart from the state, follows in many ways with what we think about with regards to, democracies and autocracies, sort of thinking about state leadership and responsiveness. And so the evidence to date points to the idea that leaders outside, kind of outside of the state, who are selected in more competitive manners are actually more responsive. We see that with Acemoglu and Robinson and Reed in Sierra Leone and chieftaincies. We see that with Electoral in terms of thinking about tribes in Jordan. So there's a lot of evidence that we should think about leadership selection rules, not only with regards to state institutions, but with regards to all these other institutions. The second part is to think about the engagement, the rules of engagement. The example I gave you about sort of the religious leaders is one example of that, but we can also think on the broader sense of individualist versus collectivist rules, right? Obviously, to some extent, all rules are individualist in terms of what they tell us how individuals should act, but they're very different in terms of how we think about, how we think about the rewards with regards to these rules. In other words, individualist rules are saying, I do something positive, I get positively rewarded. I do something negative, I get negatively rewarded. It's all about, right? Collectivist rules say, I do something positive, we all get positively rewarded. I do something negative, we all get negatively rewarded, right? So, and interestingly enough, a lot of the work, for example, in clientelism has really assumed individualist rules, right? Thinking about the vote buying literature, etc. Much of that is about thinking about, a sort of dyadic transactions that stay dyadic in every nature, right? And the reality, I would almost argue, is that most of the world actually works in a collectivist notion and not an individualist one, or at least enough of it does that we need to start to ask the question, is it an individualist or collective, right? And so to give you one example of this, two examples. One is that when we talk to people in Jordan about why do you support the candidate you do, you would find people supporting candidates they did not like, right? They did not think would win, right? But the reason that they would support them is because, if we all sort of at least support this candidate, then they will show, this is being a co-tribal candidate, it will show that we're present, right? That it had a very different meaning to it than just that we like this. And there was a kind of Kepke piece. It's actually in that case, it's about why do the Mayans in the Netherlands send basically burial funds, which are not insignificant in terms of their amount, back to Ghana when they don't know the person who died, they don't plan to be there, they don't plan to be buried there, right? But it's because their family is there, their family plans to be buried there, and actually sort of the institutional rules there are that if you don't can make the contribution, then you can't get buried in the area, right? So it's about the shame that goes to their family and the promise to their family, not the promise to the individual who's deciding to make the contribution. The third set of rules, so those are, again, I'm trying to give you broad categories of rules that you think through. The third set are thinking about group boundaries and boundary names. And here we're talking about the rules are around, how do we demonstrate that we are a group, right? So it can be by dress, right? So if you think about, Hasidic Jews with sort of the kind of the tassels and the fringe. But you can also think about it in terms of what you can say and can't say, right? And so in this case, I'll give you an example from the Libyan elections, which I was at. I was doing some NDI work at the time, party strengthening and that type of work. And I was talking to somebody who had been elected, and he was telling me sort of the usual story about basically kind of head counting, right? So he said, he was from a minor tribe, and basically, their tribe had 5,000, and they got together with the tribe that had 3,000, one that had 2,000. Interestingly, he made the point that they met during weddings because they knew it would be less likely to be detected by the kind of major tribe. But they had 8,000, they had 10,000 when they put themselves together, and so they knew they could win. And I said, well, that's great, but how did you know that everybody was going to be voting for you? And he essentially says, we didn't, and we don't expect everybody's going to vote for us, but we know that. He hasn't put it this way. The probability of our people not voting and their people not voting is about the same, so it's okay. But then I said, what happens if somebody doesn't vote for you? If you punish them, what's the implication of something? And he said, they cannot vote for us. What they can't do is stand up and say that they're not going to vote for us. And if you think also, I've done a lot more work in Jordan as well, but if you think about the kind of election text where it says, this family is supporting this candidate, right? So the notion that you would actually stand up and say it and basically break this appearance of unity was unacceptable. It wasn't necessarily unacceptable to not vote for the person. So I think those, again, as I started out with the example of kind of yard signs, I think those kinds of appearances are important, right? In addition to simply, how does it affect what somebody does? The other thing I wanted to sort of draw our attention to, okay, I'll draw our attention to quickly is sort of the ways in which we can think about these rules not only as being affecting what individuals do, but affecting how we should think about what we think of as state rules. Okay? And that state rules are often, or state institutions are often institutions that not only affect action within the state, but also affect action outside of it, and therefore affect how they get developed. So this will take you back to 2012. And as they're trying to come up with the electoral rules for the election, there were a couple of considerations. One was that under Gaddafi, parties had been outlawed, right? In fact, there was essentially a statement that would say that translates basically to be a party member is to be a traitor. To not have revealed not only that you were a party member, but that you knew a party member was actually capital punishment by death, right? So people at the end of the Gaddafi period are not exactly keen on joining parties. So from the international community's perspective and some others, that was a problem, right? The other thing is that it's a very traditional society. So it was a society in which women tended to be at home, and there was a period of kind of the global community is interested in promoting women and gender equality, and so there's an interest in making sure that takes place. So the result was that they came up with this idea that they were going to have a two-tiered system, right? Individual seats and party seats, and in their mind is Germany, right? Individual seats and party seats kind of overlaying each other nicely. And that within the party seats, then on the party list, they were going to be basically required to have as many candidates as seats in the district, but they were also going to have an alternating zipper quoting, right? So basically, women, men, in the system. And so they announced this. And pretty much all hell breaks loose. They get people, delegates coming from the different areas. They get the phone calls ringing, the fax machine, and basically people are saying, we can't have this scenario. And where you're getting this from is particularly the kind of the rural areas and the mountainous areas where you've got a lot of Amazigh and Arab communities next door to each other, and other communities that have not necessarily had good relations. And they're saying, really, my representative can be from that community, so that's not acceptable. And you're also getting people who say we can't get women to be on this list because we can't even get them to go out and campaign, yet alone if they were elected to go down to Tripoli and actually sit in parliament. So the result is we get a lot of negotiations, at the end of which it looks like this. You have places like Libyan, right, which have only independent seats. You have places like Tripoli that has to pick up the PR seats, right? It's from an electoral perspective, it's a disaster, right? Because you have all of these different districts now are not overlapping in a nice German style. It's actually very, very difficult to administer this. And people say they don't understand. But actually, in a sense, who didn't understand was essentially was the electoral designers, right? The people who were thinking that the only way in which these electoral institutions mattered was about, seats in parliament, and not that they were actually challenging rules about, gender and things. I'm going to go through this really fast, and I'm happy to come back to any of this, but I want to leave time for some input. So basically, I think it has a lot of implications for the studies of development politics, at least I hope it does. I think it asks us to rethink development programs and policies, right? So, there's a lot of questions about isomorphism. It actually asks us to take context seriously, but then what I'm trying to do is tell us how we can take context seriously, right? Similarly, going with the grain and, thinking about, problem-driven iterative PIA. The way to put it, have been ways of thinking about how can we understand things don't work the way we want them to work. But I think that I'm trying to provide a foundation on which we can build these understandings. I also think that we can ask some theoretical questions. I'm happy to come back to any of these, but one question is, if we stop thinking about formal and informal as mapping directly on state and non-state, right? Then we can start to ask how important is the parchment nature, the formality of institutions. And in this work with Karen and Lauren and Melanie Phillips, the answer is formality matters, but because it helps to sort of provide legibility to others in the community, whether it's from the state or from, in this case, customary actors, didn't matter. You can also ask about how authorities compete with each other. When do they do so, and who wins out? And in this work with Lauren Honig and Adam Harris, what we're finding is that, not surprisingly maybe, but actual physical distance to state infrastructure makes a difference in how much the state can then change land management practices within. We're asking, how do boundary rules affect behavior, right? So this idea that we can either be easier or more difficult to literally move into an area, and that there can be rules about who engages successfully with whom. And here we're finding that having the ability to move into an area and questions about who engages with whom can actually affect things like, are you registered to vote in that village or outside of it? Do you tend to vote with the chief or with somebody, or sort of outside of that as There's a lot of other questions. I mean, there's people who play roles in both, both communities or more than one community. How do they affect, basically kind of the sort of competition between the communities or authorities? How do they shape institutions and affect outcomes? There's a lot more to be done to think about dynamics and change over time. And there's a lot more to be done to think about aggregation of individual behaviors into outcomes. But overall, I'm hoping that it changes the ways in which we think through the actual process of inquiry, that we start by saying, how do individuals see this rather than what do institutions think that individuals should do, that we try to understand what are the various sets of authorities that are relevant to the issue at hand, and that we then ask what's expected of them and what do we expect then that people would do and the outcomes that would come. Finally, it matters, it affects or means that we need to sort of develop new measures. And so one of the things I talk an hour on this too, unfortunately, but basically we've been spending the last decade almost working on developing local governance processes indicators. What I would say would be the equivalent of a census, but thinking instead about, of how many beds and bathrooms do people have, to thinking about how do they actually engage, right? Which authorities matter, what institutions do they follow. Finally, that's all the basis of GLD current work, but also some of the other work that's going on. Like I said, we're working on the LGBTI, we're working on migration work, we're doing work on gender especially, and also thinking about sort of the roles of family and friends. We're doing some work on competing authorities, trying to understand how they compete, when do they actually collude and when don't they? Thinking about emerging in different contexts, the pandemic in emerging cities, and then finally some beginning work on local governance. That was a lot to throw at you. So I appreciate your time. I welcome questions and comments now, but also, over time. And there's the website that I we also have scholarships.
Love to talk about the scholarships. Don't go over there, stay here. Thank you so much.
No, it's not, sorry, I should be clear. They're small research grants, so they're not, we're not competing.
Great, now question. Please.
Thank you so much for really I just had a couple of questions. Please, if you were elaborating. First concern salience of the variable. I wondered a little bit about the role of trust. Must matter, and I want to explain how it fits into this book. Second question is about your strength of arena variable. So you talked about scope. So basically, strong arenas can capture more scope. And I wondered about this when you said it, because I suspect that in some cases there might be a trade-off. You have institutional arenas that are like succinct, short, sharp, well-defined, powerful, as opposed to being large scope, but actually quite weak across space. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks. So with regards to trust, that is a great question. And I think that to some extent, when we're talking about the extent to which, there's two places where it comes in. One, when we're talking about why it is that the domain congruence matters, right? And we were saying that, basically we find that there's something called domain legitimacy, right? One could think of that, and we talk about it in the paper in terms of expertise. So one could think about that is how much do I trust this authority with regards to this issue, right? So there, it sort of slips in that way. It's not directly that way, and directly stated that way. We actually, in that same paper, look at generalized trust, right? So that, a lot of times you'll see in the barometers, for example, that people ask, how much do you trust this leader? And there we found that there is a distinction. So generalized trust in leaders didn't make the difference. It doesn't account for why you're more likely to be listening to this leader on this issue, right? It was much more than kind of the specific trust with regards to that we trust. So the idea that more powerful or more pointed institutions or more pointed authorities who say, okay, I don't care what you do with anything else. I only care what you do about this, right? Would have more influence. That's a really interesting point. I think you might be right? And the issue would be to say, okay, the reason that they do is because they're putting all of their energy into, affecting what you do on that particular issue, right? So in some ways, it would be a different way of saying, all things equal, right? If we're talking about the equal amount of resources that are going to be used to support implementation of this rule, right? Then I wouldn't expect that you were right. But if what we're saying is, therefore, you put more resources into, kind of monitoring and rewarding and responding to what you've done over that particular issue, then it makes sense.
I have a question.
Yes.
There are two questions on the floor. It's to do with corruption. You did mention corruption when you were starting your presentation, and I wonder, corruption is problematic if you have a state-centric view of how things should be done. But if you take perhaps a grassroots perspective, corruption serves a purpose for people who are benefiting from it. If you're trying to save your kid from going to the army and paying the bribe to the officer, saves your kid's life, serves a purpose, right? So how do we understand corruption if you take a multi-dimensional perspective? And what kind of policy impacts would you think might follow from a different perspective, non-state-centric perspective?
No, you're right. So you focus on the, corruption serves a purpose if you're the parent trying to save your kids from going to the army. I mean, corruption also is in my view, is how to put it, the response to a different set of institutions, right? So, if what it is I decided to serve you first because you're in my family, right? Then what that is doing is actually reinforcing our familial ties. It's reinforcing the social insurance I expect later on when I need your help. So there's a lot of different ways in which corruption actually is understood as the problem. The problem with corruption is that it sort of circumvents a rule, right? Yep. That is there for a purpose. Yep. Well, yes, it circumvented that rule that was there for a purpose, but it actually followed this rule, which is also there for a purpose, right? So to me, that's the way that this framework helps us to understand corruption. And the result of that is, okay, it depends on who you are. If you're the state, and what I want to do is get you to follow this rule, the one you just circumvented as opposed to this rule, then it means something like, well, okay, maybe the way to do that is to make sure that I'm not as reliant on you for my social insurance in the future as I can be on the state, right? So the more that the state can pick that up, the less likely that our ties would be unbreakable, and I can now I can actually follow the state, the state sort of institution.
Any other questions? Please.
Echoing again, thanks for your presentation. I thought I spied on your slides a footnote that referenced about that, about how these concepts might apply to informal institutions, whether the rise in informal institutions, and that's a big assumption, very true, but the rise in informal institutions, in fact, some of these the concepts might be quite different.
So I want to distinguish formality from, right? So essentially, this, and you see this, I don't know if you've read the work by Stanford. Actually, I love this work. It's got like another little mini book that basically makes the argument that sometimes, in his case, sort of formalizing institutions can undermine actually sort of good relations, right? And the example he gives is an example from, it's not his study, but this type of daycare study, which found that, first the problem was they wanted people to pick up their kids on time. That in order to get them to pick up their kids on time, they basically put in a rule that said, if you pick up your kids late, it's like $30. And now all of a sudden everybody picked up their kids late because, before at least some people were thinking, okay, I'm not going to make the teacher say after, this is going to be a problem. Now they're like $30, okay, I'm good. I'm going to pick up my kid when I have the time to pick up my kid. So essentially everything went wrong because they had formalized something. Now, the problem with that study is that you're actually changing the rule at the same time as you're formalizing, right? So like, how do we understand formality versus understanding the rule of the institution itself? And so what I wanted to do was to understand, does formality, does actually having something written down make a difference to people? Or is it about, or is it about the change? And so, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but in the study that we've done with Karen Correa and Melanie Brooks and Conan, basically we tried to separate these. I mean, it's a first step in this direction, right? But we tried to separate the formality. We thought of it document, how it's written, and in this case it's land tenure, right? So does it make a difference if it's formal or informal, and does it make a difference if it's state customary? And basically, there's a lot of work in the development world about making state, thinking that state formal, documents are the way to go towards land security. And what we found was that people felt much more secure if it was formal. In other words, if they had a document, they felt it was more secure. But they actually didn't sort of think that it was more secure if it was state versus customary. And our understanding of that, with other parts of the study, was that one reason was because if I had it written down, I can show it to all of you, right? So it wasn't necessarily that the force of the state or the customary authority was behind. It was the fact that it was now legible, right? And the legibility makes sense. So you asked a slightly different question about how that would change, over time, and how we should think about those changes. I honestly haven't gotten that far, right? So I think it's a great next question. But I do think that formality itself makes a difference.
Okay, with that, thank you so much for a thought-provoking presentation. Really appreciate your time. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.